Hi. Wow, this is a big group. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for that really nice introduction, Paul. This is a hard day for me. I've been preparing for it a lot. I've talked about this a lot, but it's difficult to talk about it in front of a big group. I appreciate you being here today for this very important conversation about students, about loss, and about trauma. I was asked to be here today to share this with you, so I hope that we can talk about this together. My presentation is called the S word, and I haven't practiced with the clicker today, so I hope that it works well for me. I like to start with this slide, and if you just take a moment and look at it and think about it. Robin Williams really has become a symbol for us in society of somebody who was happy on the outside but had a whole lot going on inside. We talk a lot about kindness and the idea that everyone we meet may be battling something inside that we don't know about. But I think that we kind of sometimes give lip service to this idea without really thinking about the fact that people have a lot going on inside that we don't know about. So as we talk today and you listen to what I'm going to talk about, I would really like you to think about the idea that people everywhere have a lot going on inside that you might not know about. And that may be the person sitting next to you at the table, that may be the person that you're living with, and that is true of a lot of the students sitting in front of you. Oh, shoot. I like to begin all my presentations now that I do with staff, that I do with my teachers, and that I even do with students, with really talking about how are you feeling right now, today, at this moment. This is actually, so I would like you to take just a moment and reflect in your own head about how you are feeling right now. Are you happy and ready to learn? Are you sad or tired? Are you anxious? Or are you angry and frustrated? And if you take a moment and just really reflect on how you are feeling right now, and then if you'll take a moment and just write that down for yourself with a couple of thoughts about why you're feeling that way. I began implementing this strategy in all my presentations this year after reading an article about trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed schools and classrooms. This is a strategy practiced at Bethlehem schools in New Hampshire. These zones or check-ins are a common tool for teachers in trauma-sensitive schools. It doesn't really matter whether you use colors or numbers or whatever spin a teacher wants to put on it during their day. The idea is that we're checking in with people constantly, but the other idea is that we can't always expect that everybody, when they show up the school day or the school door at 8 o'clock a.m., is happy and ready to learn. I know not all of you in here today may feel happy and ready to learn. Maybe there's something on your mind. Maybe you're thinking about a relative, a friend. Maybe you've suffered something recently yourself that has your thoughts somewhere else. Maybe you're worried about someone. Our students think the same thing every day, and yet we expect them to come to school happy and ready to learn at 8 o'clock and push everything else aside for the day. This is not always possible for them, and we really need to think about where they are each day. So I was asked to be here today as a parent and a person who had gone through something recently. I need to tell you a little bit about who I am so that you understand the context of my presentation. As Paul noted, I've been an employee of Washoe County School District for 26 years. Hard to believe, I look really young. I started as a mere child. I was like 12. I was also a partner to my husband for 25 years. I was a high school English teacher. I was a wife for 19 years. I'm a program coordinator. I'm a parent of 3 children. I'm very educated. I'm a teacher. I'm a mother. I talk about these things in this way because while I've been asked to talk to you as a parent and give a parent perspective, as you all know who have been in education a long time, it's very difficult to separate those things. I can't just talk about my experience as a parent when I'm a teacher, because the teacher part always comes in, right? We always have to tell people, well, this is how I feel as a teacher and as an educator. So when I talk to you today, I might not always be able to just talk about the parent perspective, because the teacher part always comes in. So I want to be very transparent about that. So a little bit about my story. This part of my story began in July of 1994. I met my husband actually on the 4th of July. We met at Nevada Beach. We had some friends in common. We spent a whole day together on July 4th, 1994. As you can see, he was very handsome and very cute. He was very friendly. We had both just graduated from college. We were both about to start our careers. Dan had a degree in civil engineering. He worked his life in road construction. He had all kinds of certifications to do all sorts of special inspection. He was a very hard worker. He worked very hard for our family and our lives. I was instantly attracted to him. He had an amazing smile. He had bright green eyes. And I won't lie, he had a really fast motorcycle. And I've always liked fast things. So I wanted to date him because he had a motorcycle. The next 25 years were pretty standard. We had our first son, Cole, in 2001. Our second child, Caleb, was born in 2006. And our third child, our daughter, was born in 2009. Things were not always perfect, but I thought it was pretty great. We lived in a great house, we bought and sold houses, we went on vacations, we live in a great neighborhood with wonderful neighbors. Our kids play sports, they ski all winter. We have a boat, we skied and camped all summer. We enjoyed all the parts and pieces of northern Nevada. I mean, we were the typical family who worked through lots of things in our lives and still managed to stay together. Fast forward to spring break 2019. We didn't go anywhere for spring break because we had lots of other things going on. The first Sunday of spring break, we enjoyed one of the last ski days of the year. I remember it because there was a fresh coat of powder, very small, very slight, but it was a beautiful bluebird day. My husband actually commented on how well he skied that day. It was one of his best ski days. Monday, March 25th was my 19-year wedding anniversary. We actually talked to our kids about how lucky they were to still have parents that were married after all those years. The next day, our boys went to Austin, Nevada, to my family farm, to my parents' farm, where they spend a lot of vacations and holidays. They work out there all the time. Our daughter stayed home because she had some other things going on in her life. On Thursday, March 28th, my husband and I get up early every morning. We always get up before our kids. We always drink coffee and talked every morning. That morning, we sat on our couch. We talked about our son's upcoming graduation. We talked about a graduation party. We talked about college for him. We talked about our future retirements, because, 26 years, I'm getting close. And we talked about grandchildren and just what that would look like and how exciting it would be to be grandparents. My husband came home from work that day, and then he left again. I wasn't totally alarmed, because he'd been having some difficulties recently. But he was gone that night. I woke up somewhere in the middle of the night, and I was really panicked that he was gone. I didn't sleep much. I was up all night long, worried about him. I was texting him, and his phone was off, but I could tell where he was. So I wasn't too concerned. When he still hadn't come back the next morning, And I'd been up all night. I was very, very worried, of course. He turned his phone on about 7 in the morning, and I started calling him and texting him. He wouldn't return any of my calls. He wouldn't answer my calls, nor did he return any of my text messages. But he was driving, and I could tell where he was driving, because we have family plans and stuff like that. And about 8, I looked at my daughter and I said, I need to go find your dad. And she said, can I go with you? And I said, no, you can't. And I dropped her off. And then somewhere between 8 and 9, I tracked my husband's phone to a location off of I-80 next to the river. And I went to find him. I went directly to where he was. I found his company vehicle. I drove up right next to him. I thought he was sleeping. I got out of my car. I banged on his truck window. He didn't wake up. I opened the door of his work truck and found my husband dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And that morning, March 29th, my present became my past in a second. I was 100% blindsided. My husband never mentioned suicide. He never joked about suicide. He never threatened suicide. He was not on medications. He was not depressed outwardly. Never said anything to anyone. He drove out of my life, and everything was over. My marriage was over. My family was completely different. My life as I knew it ended in a second. And I just stood there for several minutes. It was the most shocking moment of my entire life, and completely unexpected. But lucky for us, spring break is 2 weeks. So that was really weird. That was halfway through spring break. That day, of course, was super chaotic. There's all kinds of crazy things that happen when you're the first person on a scene like that. I was there for many, many hours. There was lots of stuff that day that was really crazy. But this is kind of what happens. If you yourself have never had a traumatic loss, what really happens is that time gets completely screwed up. That next week, all the time was measured from that moment forward. So it was first 12 hours since Dan died, and then it was 24 hours, and then it was 48 hours, and then every time was from that moment on. We had lots of people around, lots of family, all those kinds of things, but my kids and I just sort of were in this weird haze of sleeping, not sleeping, eating, not eating, crying and sobbing, and it was just this really strange haze for about a week. And then all of a sudden, about a week later, Saturday-ish, I realized, oh my gosh, my kids have got to go back to school. And at that point, I had 3 children at 3 different school sites. So, part 2 of my story is that I went into mom mode. And if you're a mom or a parent, you know what mom mode feels like. So all this other stuff that all week long I'd been swirling around in my head all of a sudden was like, I got to take care of these kids who are going back to school tomorrow. And I was then on my computer emailing teachers and counselors and principals and all this stuff at 3 different school sites, and just in this flurry of craziness. And nothing about today is about blaming or not blaming or congratulating or not congratulating or any of those, because I want to just state up front that I know that everybody cares. But things don't always go real well. There was lots of miscommunication, lots of me waiting for responses that didn't happen. My youngest child was in 4th grade. I was absolutely panicked about what happens in 4th grade classrooms the day after spring break. Hey, what did everybody do during spring break? Oh, you went to so-and-so, you went there, oh. I mean, I was so worried about my little girl and what her classroom would look like that morning. So I had all these thoughts swirling in my head, and I didn't always get responses from people that I thought I should get responses from that would assure me that everything was going to be okay in my kids' classrooms. And again, that's not to say that anybody is at fault. It's just that there's a lot of stuff going on, and sometimes people don't let you know that everything's going to be okay. But I'm also not alone in my feelings. What I'm really going to talk about for this next little chunk is what most parents feel when they lose a spouse. This information comes from a national poll of bereaved parents and spouses, and I've really chunked it into several pieces. So my first chunk is about the school experience. And I'm going to share with you some statistics and then talk to you about how my experience really exemplifies these statistics. So first, 6 of 10 parents say it's hard to know what their child needs from them after losing a parent. 4 in 10 say that their child's school was not well prepared to help their children deal with their loss. And 3/4 of parents said that there are not enough resources to help their grieving children or themselves. Now, with my oldest child, he was a senior at the time. It was important to him that he really wanted me to keep things quiet. He didn't want to be surrounded with people. I tried to honor his wishes, and so did his school. However, that was the wrong thing to do. What happened in that case was that only his current teachers knew what happened, but he had several teachers that had had him 2 and 3 years before that. Like he had a weights teacher that had had him 3 years, but that he didn't have that year. So in my effort to honor what he wanted, I did not allow him the school support that he needed. There were people that would have supported my son that couldn't because they didn't know what happened to him. And that was on me. But it was also, I don't think anybody told me that I should have done something differently, and I didn't know. So we just kind of do the best we can, and I know that everybody did the best they could, but it's really hard when 2 or 3 months later a teacher comes up to you and says, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know. I would have done so much more for Cole had I known." So I really tried to do what I thought was best for each child, but that wasn't always the best choice at the time. I think grief and loss is really difficult for kids, and we don't have a lot of systems in place to help when these things happen. I know we have school counselors, and they're amazing, and my kids did go to their counselors sometimes, but they can't just spend a whole day with a counselor. There's not a lot of other support things in our school systems. The next piece that statistically that parents really talk about is the home experience. So in addition to the parent, the surviving spouse, trying to manage our own grief, our thoughts really just are about our kids all the time. Nearly 4 in 10 of us say that they think their child worries frequently about them getting sick or dying. It is very difficult to be the only surviving parent when you have kids who are not yet of legal age. 2 days after my husband died, my middle child looked at me and said, Mommy, please don't let anything happen to you. You are all I have left. And that is such a huge weight and responsibility on your shoulders when your child says that to you. When you realize that that other half, that other person that your kids have depended on is gone from your world. And it does happen, and every child who has lost one parent says that to the surviving parent. They are scared to death they will lose you too. And unfortunately, some kids also lose the other parent. 2/3 said their kids worry at least sometimes about their surviving parent going through life alone. My kids worry about me. They know how much I loved my husband, and they know my heart is broken, and they worry a lot about me, and it's hard for them. 43% of us worry daily about how their children are coping. I talk to my kids every day. I ask them every day. I check in with them. Those check-ins that we talked about at the beginning, I check in with my kids every day. How are you doing today? How are you feeling? What's your number? Where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? My oldest child is 18. He just graduated. I don't think there is a good age to lose your parent to suicide, but I think that if you're an 18-year-old male, it's particularly difficult. My oldest son is struggling a lot right now, and I worry about him all the time. He said to me a couple weeks ago, because we just passed our 6-month anniversary, which was really tough on all of us, and he said, 6 months doesn't seem like a long time compared to trying to figure out how to live the rest of your life without your dad. And he said, my dad was my best friend. My kid is trying to figure out how to live the rest of his life without his best friend. And I can't help him figure that out. Because what I realized is that I got all that. My parents are still alive. I got all that with my parents. My parents were at my wedding. My parents saw my babies be born. My kid doesn't get any of that with his dad. And I can't fix that for him. And he is struggling right now with that. The other piece that's very difficult for us and our kids when we lose people and have traumatic events in our lives is the extended experience. So this is the support we get outside of our homes and outside of our schools. 3/4 of parents said that the support of family and friends has a major impact on the ability of grieving kids to cope. And I will say that I think that this is for positive or for negative. Okay? It does. Extended people and extended supports do have a major impact on our ability to cope, but it can also really affect our ability to cope in poor ways or in negative ways. 56% say that most adults don't know how to talk to them or their kids when they encounter them in public. Yes, true. And this is why my presentation is called the S word. If you lose somebody to this very taboo thing called suicide, you get very crazy reactions from people. I read in one of my, well, you know, I read a lot. People know this about me. But I read a lot of all kinds of stuff. I read a lot of stuff about widows. I read a lot about recovering. I read a lot about recovering from loss. I read a lot about trauma. I read somewhere once that your response to people conveys your values. I cannot tell you how many people that I've said, I lost my husband recently. They say, oh, and then I say, I lost him to suicide. I have had people flat out look me in the eye and say, that is so selfish. Okay, that's pretty harsh. I will tell you that my husband was the most selfless person I've ever met. You may have your opinions about suicide, but to say that to anyone who's recently lost someone to suicide is unfair, rude. I mean, it's just rude. And you just really have to be careful about what values you're conveying when you respond to somebody, especially children. My kids loved their dad. If you say something to them about how their dad died, or what you think about people who commit suicide or die by suicide, you're really saying something about their father. And that's not any of your place to criticize their father. So we have to be very careful about how we respond or talk to people who have lost people in any kind of traumatic event, be that a drug overdose, a murder, a suicide. Things happen in people's lives that we cannot control, and us being judgmental about how people's people left this earth, it's just not fair to that person who is grieving so hard about losing their person. I never thought this was going to happen to me. I just need people to be kind to me, not be judgmental about how I lost my husband. So, I was really glad to hear what Paul said in his introduction, because the third part of this is why I matter. And while my story is very important because it's mine, and I kind of say, hey, guess what? I'm your poster child for this can happen to anyone. This can happen to anyone. I live in a nice neighborhood, and my kids go to nice schools and all that kind of stuff, and this happened to me, so it can happen to anyone, and it does happen to everyone, and can. I matter because I am one of many. One of many. So Paul actually mentioned some of these statistics already, but what you need to know is nearly half now of U.S. children have been exposed to at least one traumatic event. What I didn't share in the opening is that not only did I lose my husband, but 2 months later, I also lost my nephew to suicide. My kids now have 2 traumatic events, okay? 2 in the last 6 months. 1 in 5 kids have been exposed to several, and they actually say over 5, okay? So don't think that it's only in certain schools or certain places or in low SES places. It's not. 50% of students have had at least one traumatic event in their lives, so that affects all of your students and all of your schools. Further, 1 in 15 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the age of 18. By the age of 18, 1 in 15. That's a lot of kids who are going to be without parents and siblings by 18. So statistically, that's about 7% of your students will be grieving and will be experiencing loss. And why does that matter? Well, a 2016 meta-analysis, which is really your best research because it looks at all the previous research on that topic, did say that students who have experienced trauma have cognitive shows that it interferes with memory and attention, good health, emotional stability. Students who experience traumatic stress perform worse academically and cognitively and have worse behavior in the classroom. So these are the kids that are your problem kids all the time. The behavior is a symptom. There's probably a cause for that behavior. Okay? They're not just being problems. So what can we do in terms of trauma-sensitive classrooms and schools? I have some quick tips. I actually also have some handouts and flyers for care of your grieving person. I was going to put them out on tables, but I couldn't get here early. Sorry. I mean, I could, but I didn't want to be amongst you today. I mean, I do, but sorry. I can't hug and see people before I'm going to do something like this. It's too hard for me. Number 1. Become familiar with the normal signs of loss and grieving. And what's normal for kids is staring off into space, being disruptive, sometimes being a class clown, not doing their work. I mean, those are normal signs of grieving and loss for kids. The things that you don't think they should be doing in class is the things they're going to be doing in class if they're grieving. Number 2, take your personal loss inventory and become comfortable and transparent. You all probably have lots of loss. While death is the first loss, There's lots of losses underneath that. Financial loss, job loss, divorce. I mean, I could list a ton of them. Okay? You need to be comfortable with your loss. Unprocessed, unaddressed loss and grief, #1 suicide factor. So I would encourage you, if you have unprocessed loss and grief from your past, if you were one of those people that people in your life said, don't cry, you might want to think about getting to the bottom of that. It's not healthy to not process loss. Normalize grief and grief symptoms. We need to really start talking about this in schools with kids. It's okay to grieve, it's okay to cry, it's okay for boys to cry, it's okay to talk about it. There are still kids in school who get made fun of when their parents die. They get blamed. They get told it's their fault. This is happening every day in our schools. And I know because I hear about it from the other kids that my kids talk to. Because once you have a loss, all of a sudden you're surrounded by other people who have had losses. That's what happens. #4, be a positive grief role model. It's really important that we show our students that you can have something horrible happen to you and move forward in your life. Become a better, stronger person because of it. Okay, this did happen to me. It doesn't define me forever. It's just part of who I am now. #5, use tools such as drawing, writing, role-playing, coloring, all those kinds of things to help process loss. And #6, my favorite one, be a listener. Listen, listen, listen some more, and then keep listening. We don't need advice. We don't need to be told it's okay. We don't need to be told it's going to get better. I don't need you to tell me that you had a divorce and you figured it out, so I will too. Because guess what? It's not the same. It's not the same. So minimize the advice and just listen. Even kids just want you to listen. And this is my favorite, because you know, textbooks really like to tell us that when you grieve and when something happens to you, you go in these stages. First you'll feel this way, then you feel... Who in here has lost someone? Oh good, most of you. Who in here felt like you did this? Who feels like grief is more like this big old thing on the left, on the right? Yeah, raise your hand if it feels like that. Yeah, and yeah, all of a sudden, maybe 10 years later, you hear a song on the radio or a food or something like that, and you just go boom, and you're crying in your car, right? That happens. That's how it really is. That's how grief works. And we need to accept that that's how it works for kids too. And you know what? It works even more like that for our kids. More like that. There's no timetable. There's no easy, clean, you go through this, this, and this, and then you're done. So yeah, 6 months down the road, my Caleb might just start crying in class. That might happen, and that's okay. So last, I want to quickly talk about Child and Teen Grief Awareness Day. We often hear, because I'm so close, nailed this on time, be like 2 minutes over. Child and Teen Grief Awareness Day is coming up Thursday, November 21st. We celebrate this day every year, the Thursday before Thanksgiving. I think people think it's a sad day. It's not a sad day. It's a happy day. It's a day to let all of our students know that we are supporting them and that we're there for them. This year it's a superhero theme. We'll be pushing out lots of tools for this for you. But I want to talk a moment about why this is important. We often hear that the worst thing is to lose a fill in the blank. People usually say child. There's nothing worse in life than to lose a child. I kind of say, says the person who never found her husband in his work truck with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But you know, that's just my experience. I have not lost a child. I've only lost my husband in the way that I did. But one of my favorite grief books really talks about comparison. And she said, we've always heard that comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is also the thief of grief, and it's the thief of empathy. We do not compare grief. It is not worse to lose your blank than your blank, or you're this than you're that. And when we start comparing grief, we forget people. Our kids are the forgotten mourners. People who lose children have other children. Those siblings are forgotten mourners. People who lose children to suicide often have other children. Those children are in schools. I actually describe this as being like when you throw a pebble in water, you know, and it ripples out. So I'm the center of my situation, right? He was my spouse. But there's all these other people. There's my kids. There's all these other people. They're the ripples. The ripples are our forgotten mourners. And if we ever say that one person has it worse than the others in grief, we're forgetting all the other people. Like I told you, my son is having such a hard time right now. And if I say that my grief is worse than his, or that it's worse for me to lose my husband than it is for him to lose his dad, that is so unfair to his relationship with his father, to what that person meant to him. Don't ever compare grief. It's the thief of empathy for our students. So November 21st is really about letting students know that we support them and that we have no forgotten mourners. Children do not grieve alone, and we need to let them know that we are there for them. Thank you very much for letting me be here today and share my story with you.